Good afternoon. I'm just going to get started with the meeting as scheduled for today. Our first budget committee meeting of the year officially. Today's meeting on August 27th, we have with us at the dais Council Members Reich, Vice President Jenkins, Council Member Schrader, Council Member Lisa Goodman, and Council Member Andrew Johnson. Please let the record reflect that we have a quorum. We are about to have a quorum.
We do now.
That we have a quorum. Thank you, Councilmember Fletcher. And before you is the agenda for today's meeting. The one quick item that was added this morning was just a formal receive and file of the city budget as we enter this deliberation phase. So that was the one change you saw in an email this morning. With this, we don't have to approve the agenda. Sorry, I chaired another meeting this morning. It's a little different procedurally. With this, we have one item for receive and file and another item for discussion. The first is to formally receive the 2019 city budget. And as the mayor released his proposed budget for 2019, we've now officially transitioned into the council deliberation phase and putting together next year's budget together. So I'm excited to work with all of you and the mayor and enterprise leaders in putting together a package that represents the values of our residents and generates a strong return on investment for the dollars that are spent. So as my colleagues are well aware, this proposal is robust and it's full of a lot of new ideas and priorities for the enterprise as a whole. So before we move on to the departmental presentations, it's important that we gain a strong understanding of what has been put forward. For that, we have this discussion item. And while nothing beats sitting down with all 650 pages of the report, we're lucky enough to have a budget director here today to hit the highlights and major changes, as well as how this proposal impacts our levy. So first, I'd like to make a motion to receive and file this 2019 city budget, the mayor's recommended 2019 city budget. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? That carries. And now we will move on to our discussion item. Mr. Intermill, thank you for joining us. Go ahead.
Madam Chair, thank you. Appreciate that. And before we start, just a few important housekeeping items. One, I'd be remiss if I didn't remind everyone that it truly does take a village to put together a budget. So while I'm the one standing here in front of you, a lot of work went on behind the scenes. Leadership of Mark Ruff and Lori Johnson in the finance department, the budget team themselves, as well as our capital and debt team led by Mike Ablin and our controllers group led by Lyle Hodges. Say nothing of all of the work that the department heads and program experts put into this budget. The second thing I'll say is that the city's budget is absolutely complex, but it doesn't need to be confusing. So the goal here will be to try and demystify a little bit. To that point, if you have questions at any point, don't hesitate to jump in. I would rather not talk for 45 minutes straight. So with that, we'll jump into the heavy lifting.
And as you do that, if it's all right with you, if you'd rather us save questions to the end, we can do that, or just as we go along, because it is a lengthy presentation, I'll just be looking down the dais and I'll put up speaker management if people are interested in that.
Certainly, Madam Chair, I'd actually welcome questions as we go because it helps my brain keep moving.
Great.
So, first things first, in total, the 2019 city budget, and I want to be really clear when I talk about city budget, we're looking at just the city of Minneapolis portion, though the property tax levy, which we'll talk about later, includes independent boards. Here we're looking at just city spending. So the 2019 city budget, excluding those independent boards, is $1.55 billion. In front of you, you see two bar graphs that represent both the 2018 adopted budget as Council passed last December and the 2019 recommended budget as the mayor presented last Wednesday. We've separated the budget out into some major categories: ongoing spending, one-time spending, one-time affordable housing, as that's an important fixture of the mayor's recommendation this year, capital spending, as well as the new public service building. And so looking at the two side by side, hopefully it's clear that the $1.55 billion budget, which is about $140 million than the 2018 council adopted budget, really is driven by about $100 million of spending for that new public service building, the gray bar you see at the top of the bar on the right, and then about $30 million in one-time affordable housing spending, that lightest blue color that you see above the thin gray bar. Pulling those two items out of the 2019 recommended budget, the two are very similar, about $10 million different from one year to the next. So that's in general a flavor for the overall city budget. Looking specifically at the general fund, which we do pay a lot of attention to because property taxes are the largest portion of revenue for the general fund. In total, we see the expense budget growing by 26.2 million, or 5.6%. So about 2/3 of that increase represents current service level spending. So if we were just to be funding current service levels from 2018 into 2019, we would see an increase of 3.5% on the general fund. Moving beyond that, about 0.6% of the increase to the general fund, or about 20% of the total increase, is related to the Parks and Streets, 20-year Parks and Streets agreement that we're now in year 3 of. In the 2019 budget, we'll be in year 3 of. 1.3%, or about a quarter of the increase, is related to the mayor's ongoing change item investments that he has recommended, and 0.2% of the overall increase is, or 0.2% of the increase is related to the omnibus omnibus pensions legislation that was passed at the state legislature last year, which increased employer contributions for police and fire. So that's a cost of about $1 million in 19 and another $1 million in 20.
Thank you. If I could just pause you there, Council President Bender.
Thank you. I just have a quick question about the Parks and Streets funding. So last term when we adopted the commitment to the 20-year funding for Parks and Streets, we also adopted a financial plan for that funding, which used cash and fund balances in the early years and then shifted more and more to the levy over time. Have there been any changes in the proposed budget compared to that financial plan that we adopted along with the ordinance?
Council President, I appreciate the question. No, there are no changes. The mayor's recommended continuing the plan as adopted and as outlined in ordinance.
Here, I might also just interject my question. Probably the most widely known piece of the mayor's proposal is the $50+ million toward a variety of affordable housing related items. So I'm curious, with this pretty incredible dedication to fighting the affordable housing crisis, can you speak to how this kind of investment didn't lead to a huge levy increase?
Certainly, Madam Chair. So the $50 million that the mayor's recommended budget includes for affordable housing in 2019 includes about $30 million of new spending. That $30 million of new spending is one time, and so a large portion of it is outside of is coming from sources outside of the general fund, and we'll talk about that a little bit later in my presentation. But that little of it is driving to a general fund increase.
Thank you.
So then looking at the other large fund groups in the city, we see the special revenue funds, which a lot of our development projects that go through CPED run through special revenue funds, or the convention center or Target Center. The special revenue funds are increasing by about 4.4%. Most of that is related to some, as we were just discussing, use of fund balance and TIF pooling for affordable housing that, again, I'll talk about a little bit later. In addition, the convention center sees about $3.3 million more in expense this year, all related to sort of the downtown assets plan that we implemented last year and some planned drawdown of fund balances there in the convention center and the other downtown assets.
Thank you. Council President Bender.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I think you may get to this later, but my understanding is that this budget proposes using about $36 million in fund balance from the variety of funds that you've listed here, but I'm also seeing increased spending in many of them. Are there any cuts proposed in the budget?
Madam Chair, Council President, so yes, there is quite a bit of use of fund balance in this budget. There aren't any hard cuts that we traditionally think of. And I think that in years past, we've seen policymakers take a view of, well, if a dollar isn't being spent, then did we really need to invest that dollar in the first place? And I would caution a little bit against that kind of thinking. I understand it. It makes sense to me. But I do fear that sometimes it creates sort of a use it or lose it mentality. And so this budget does not propose any of those hard direct cuts to department budgets. But it did, the mayor did choose to not fund some programs that were funded on a one-time basis last year. So I look at Meet Minneapolis, and the last several years we've had some ongoing, or not ongoing, we've had a recurring one-time expenditure beyond their base contract. That didn't happen this year. And also the last few years there's been funding for collaborative safety strategies. That wasn't included this year. So there aren't any direct cuts, but there were some choices not to invest.
Is there a list of those one-time dollars from past years that were not funded this year?
Council President, unfortunately there's not a list because I was dealing with a sick child over the weekend, but it's at the top of my to-do list, and I do plan to send that around to the council hopefully in the next couple of days.
Perfect, thank you.
So the next fund grouping there is the capital projects grouping of funds. Obviously a large increase there, about 56%, and that directly relates to that $100 million that I spoke about with the new public service building. With respect to debt service, we're seeing about a 9.5% increase in expenditures there. Again, as we're building more, not only with the public service building, but this actually relates to some prior issues that we've made for parks and streets, other large projects. We have to start paying back that borrowing, and so that's where we see the increase to our debt service funds there. The internal service funds appear to go down, well, in fact, do go down from 2018 to 2019, but this is obscured a little bit because 2018 included an early retirement of some debt for the what's known as the Curry facility, which is where our fleet maintenance operation exists. So if you pull out that one-time expenditure, our internal services are growing by about 4%. And lastly, in terms of enterprise funds, these are our city-owned utilities and our parking fund. They too are increasing by about 4.4%. The mayor's recommended budget includes an increase for utility bills of 4.4% on average across households, and that comes to about $4.25 a month, again for the average residential customer, or about $51 a year. So that's a high-level overview of expenditures. On the revenue side, I think that a major feature of this budget was actually driven by some council action that occurred. Days run together, so I can't remember if it was the very end of last month or the very beginning of this month, but recently council passed an increase to business license fees for the first time since 2012. So that in total license and permit revenues across all funds is about $3.7 million more in 2019. 3.1 million of that is due directly to the fee increase. The remainder is just a growing economy. So this is a complex chart, so I'll walk you through it step by step. The gray bars that you see represent the cost of the regulatory enforcement for these activities, whereas the blue bars represent what we're generating in revenue. In each case, you see that the expense exceeds the revenue, and so the parentheses that you see on the left-hand side show what our collection percentage is. So in the best case, we are collecting 89% of our pollution control activity versus the worst case is 20% for animal, excuse me, animal control. I'm also a little bit under the weather, as is my son. So overall, across all of these activities, even with the increase, we're still only in a recovery position of about 56%. So leaves about a $12 million property tax subsidy that does persist.
Mr. Intermill, just so we can fully appreciate this illustration, can you remind us when do the actual license and permits that we have decided to raise proportionally, when does that go into effect?
Madam Chair, the increase to the fees will take effect on January 1 of 2019.
I see. Thanks.
So in his budget, the mayor has, let me step back. The $12 million property tax subsidy that I mentioned is for our current level of activity. The mayor in his budget has recommended some additional study on the regulatory activity that the city undertakes to see if indeed we are regulating at the appropriate level. So we'll be doing more study next year and intend to have continue this conversation as we look to, the term right size is often overused, but in this case I think it's right, is property use, right size the mix of fee revenue versus that enforcement expense. So looking at the property tax revenues associated with the city only increase, again, excluding the park board, other independent boards, is 15.2 million, or about 5.7%. You'll notice that's a little bit faster than the city expense, and that's because our non-property tax revenues aren't keeping up. The general fund makes up 11.9 million of that $15.2 million increase, so obviously the largest portion. The bond redemption fund, or the dollars we use to pay back that borrowing, is increasing by about 2.2 million. Our closed pension levy is increasing by $1 million, and this is related to, so when MRF, the old Minneapolis Employees Retirement Fund, merged into PARA, and I believe it was 2014, the state agreed to a certain amount of funding each year to bring the balance in associated with those pension obligations to a sort of a solvency point, or a fully funded point. Along with that, the city was required to contribute a portion. Over time, the state has not held firm with its original commitment, and so we are increasing that closed pension levy so that we can build up some fund balance associated with those closed pensions, so that if we get to a point where the state has indeed reduced its planned contribution to those closed pensions, and sticks with that lower level, we're in a position to be able to pay more on our end. And lastly, the MBC, the dollars that we raise to pay for our contribution to MBC have raised, or will raise, by about $200,000. So I can't talk about property taxes without talking about local government aid, and I think the good news with local government aid this year is that it didn't decrease. So it's not always been the case here at the city. The LGA increased by $70,632. That's not represented in thousands, that's represented in actual dollars. or a 0.1% increase. The purpose of LGA and the contribution from the state to the city is to provide property tax relief. And for a number of years it was very effective in that regard. But so I'm showing 3 years here, 2002, 2010, and 2019. 2002 being the high water mark. That was the year we received the most local government aid, about $111 million or $30 million more than we do today. In 2010, it was very near the low water mark. It was about $64 million, I believe. And then in 2019, we're back at about $80 million. So over time, what this chart is showing is the mix in the city's budget of local government aid, property taxes, and everything else. And the everything else is that dark blue at the bottom. And you see that it's even with that fluctuating LGA amount, everything else makes up about 67 to 69% of our revenue. And that leaves LGA and property taxes to make up about 31 to 33%. And so what we're seeing and what we're feeling is that as that LGA has shrunk, property taxes are just having to expand in order to cover it. And so what the program that was intended to provide property tax relief in its absence is providing property tax escalation.
Thank you. We do have a question here from Councilmember Goodman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm wondering if anywhere in the report, and I didn't jump further, you talk about the impact of fiscal disparities on the city's overall tax base, and if not, I mean, I think it's important for people who are unaware of that issue to hear more about it, because there's a lot of conversation about, well, let's just capture all the new tax growth in the city and we won't have to raise the levy, but actually we pay that to the state too. So we probably pay more into the state overall between sales tax and fiscal disparities than we get back in local government aid. And that's something that is a story for us at the legislature, but also is something people at a high level need to explain to their constituents. So I'm wondering if that's in the report, this fiscal disparities conundrum, and or how we're going to talk about that in this briefing.
So, Madam Chair, Councilmember Goodman, I think the point is very well taken. The city is what's known as a net contributor to fiscal disparities, meaning we send back a portion of our property tax capacity to the metro region that is greater than what we get from the pool. So we're paying in, for argument's sake, $1 and we get back 80 cents. We do talk about that a little bit later. I am certainly not as well versed in it as our CFO, Mark Ruff, is, and so if we want to have a little bit more discussion about that, I'm sure he could talk about that now or then. But perhaps a little bit later may make more sense.
Madam Chair, I'm fine with that, but I think we have to address this head on in public out loud with everybody going forward. It's something Barb Johnson talked a lot about in the last cycle, so people who are here kind of understand it, but not really. And I am done with going around and saying, poor us, we're not getting a lot of local government aid. Now it's at the level where we're actually paying for our success. Makes me wonder if maybe we shouldn't have as much development because we don't see the net benefit of the development for taxpayers in Minneapolis.
I would like to maybe talk about this later on in the presentation when it makes the most sense. Maybe we could ask Mark Ruff to come up.
Madam Chair, absolutely. And again, the point is absolutely well taken, Councilmember.
We have another question from Council President Bender.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This may be a kind of stating the obvious, but I did want to underscore some of what Councilmember Goodman just said and state the obvious that we will have a lot more information after November than is available now as this budget was prepared. And I think that might inform our interest in level of risk about how much we're saving versus spending as we anticipate how much money we may be receiving in local government aid and other sources and the policy around tax policy and TIF policy that the legislature and governor may take in the future. And I'll note, there are only 3 council members who are serving on this council that were in office during a recession, during the times that the city was facing LGA cuts. Most of us have been serving in a time during an economic boom, during a time when our LGA is going back up. It has been restored since I've been in office. And so I think it's just a good reminder to those of us who haven't been in office during those times that there's just a few who were. And it may, again, inform, I mean, this is not a new conversation. We had it every year last term. How much do we want to spend versus save? What level of risk do we want to take in the assumptions about revenue versus expenditures? Obviously, I mean, if we have $36 million of fund balance to spend this year, like I have a lot of questions about that and the assumptions that go into that and how we might be assuming in the future. So I think it's just part of the point that Councilmember Goodman was making.
Thank you, Councilmember Goodman.
I'm so glad you said that. But also, I think from a policy point of view, we should think about whether or not it's a good idea to build a whole bunch of building a whole bunch of affordable housing units all in 1 year, because a lot of times those units are marked up to market rate after the 20, 25, or 30-year problem, when the mortgages come due and they can't refinance at an affordable rate. So are we leaving future generations a problem like we saw here a couple of years ago, where all the 30-year mortgages were prepaid and then there was a crisis that the city had to come in? I mean, it might make sense if it's one-time money to spread it over a period of time, taking into account other risk factors like who wins the election. Sadly, I have to say that, as well as how our local government aid and fiscal disparities play out. So I do think I like this process of everyone on the council serving on the budget committee, because it might be, yay, we're putting a lot of money into affordable housing, but we might be also creating a problem for ourselves later too, that we have to determine the risk reward factor of that.
I could not have said it better myself. So just one point to the council president's comment that LGA has been restored. I would tweak that slightly to suggest LGA is being restored. So if LGA had remained flat since that high water mark of 2002, we'd have an additional $30 million in local government aid, or put another way, we could reduce the property tax levy by about 9 to 10%. Or invest in other opportunities, right? If the property tax levy were the same. Had LGA kept pace with inflation since 2002, the property tax levy could be about $80 million less, or 23%. So I think much to the conversation you're both having, this is something that we do need to continue to discuss at the city.
Just one more point from Councilmember Bender.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Sometimes when the Lisas start talking, we inspire each other, right? I mean, maybe this will come up later in the presentation too, but I did note that of the new funding proposed for affordable housing, 14.3 million is proposed for the trust fund in new money above what we normally spend. And are we expecting that to go out the door in 2019 along with the 7.2? So that would be $20 million or so in the trust fund. Would we expect that to be all spent in 2019?
Madam Chair, Council President, I think that's a great question. I am not the one in the city to answer that. I think my colleagues at CPED would be much better positioned to answer it. Though I will say to Councilmember Goodman's point, holding these dollars in a special revenue fund means that there is that opportunity for them to live on if they don't all get spent in 1 year. So there is that opportunity.
I am going to ask that we take a deeper conversation about this into the department briefings. So I will make a list and make sure that CPED is ready to respond to some of these questions and have a fulsome conversation about it.
Madam Chair, I have no doubt that they'll be ready and willing, but we'll also give them that heads up. So moving into some other revenue areas, charges for services, which are mostly made up of the city's utility revenues that I talked about a little bit ago, are up by 28.3 million. It's greater than 5.2% because this includes some other categories, such as some internal charges that we assess to non-general funds for general fund services that are provided to them. In addition, as the Council President touched on, use of fund balance is up in this budget. Some of that is represents planned, long-planned expenditure. So as Public Works builds a forecast for our utility rates, for instance, rather than keeping rates low for several years and then increasing them in 1 year in order to pay for a capital investment, we'll build a gradual increase so that a fund balance grows and then is used. And so that's some of what we're seeing here, as well as some of the $14 million that the council president discussed for the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. I think the use of fund balance is it's a dry topic, to be sure, but it's a really important one for policymakers to grapple with. And really, it's about balancing opportunity costs that's represented by, sort of overly robust fund balances, and on the other side, risk in terms of fluctuating economy or sort of having to hit ratepayers with giant bills, increases to bills in 1 year or another. So the next,
at that point, Councilmember Bender.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I do have a lot of questions about this. Our use of fund balance in the special revenue fund is going up over 300%. And can you explain to us more why we have so much fund balance, what departments these funds are coming from? Is it like real money that hasn't been spent, or is it baked into a lot of assumptions about revenue and spending? And this may be evolving over the department presentations too, but I think this is a really important point. I mean, if you look at the numbers of fund balance that are being spent, I think it just raises some detailed questions.
So, Council President, absolutely. I think that the most ready data that you'll find on the use of fund balance in the 650-page budget document itself would be found on Schedule 2 in the financial schedules section, which is on pages I3 and I4 towards the back of the document. And that shows where different fund balances are being deployed across those fund types that I had just mentioned. In terms of the question, are they real dollars? Absolutely. These are dollars that the city has collected either through property tax or charges or tax increment in the case of what's being used for the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. But to the question about assumptions that have built up over time, that's, as I was saying, we do in many cases intentionally build a fund balance so that it can be spent at a later date. So a good example of that is the way that we finance vehicles. So vehicles, excuse me. So when we purchase a vehicle for a department, that department then starts to incur monthly lease charge. And what that lease charge is doing is building a reserve so that 7-8 years down the road, when it's time to replace that vehicle, there are dollars there to be spent. And so, the enterprise fund example with the utilities that I gave, the fleet example, I think those are some of the reasons that fund balances have built up. I think when looking at use of fund balance, we have to consider the experience of the city historically as well. So in the late 90s and early 2000s, the city was in a much different financial position, having negative balances in a number of internal service funds. And so there was a sort of rapid recovery built into rate models to get out of that negative position, which then, as a pendulum swings, it can go too far to the other side. So instead of being in debt, we're in some cases have seen large fund balances build up. And so we're drawing those down intentionally in order to, again, balance out that risk and opportunity cost.
That makes sense. For the special revenue piece specifically, does that include changes in how we're using TIF?
So, Madam Chair, Council President, yes, the special revenue funds do include some TIF pooling that we'll talk about a little bit later. The general principle there, though, is that state law allows for the city to extend a TIF district and use some additional dollars generated through the TIF to pool those resources for affordable housing. And so we're seeing some of that happen in this 2019 budget. And to Councilmember Goodman's point, we have in the past as well.
Thanks.
So to the last 2 points here, our long-term liabilities proceeds sticks out as a sore thumb, increasing by 101.6%. Again, that's just the money, the debt we intend to issue for the new public service building next year. And the interest earnings are up $3 million or 100%. And this is really a good news story. As I mentioned, Mike Ablin and his contribution to this budget. He also leads our investments team. And given our real favorable interest environment, or real favorable, historically it's not real favorable, but given the last few years it's a favorable interest environment, we're seeing better returns on our cash holdings. So actually, to tie this back into that use of fund balance discussion, as fund balances build up, we don't just let those dollars sit, they do generate some interest earnings. And so in this case, $3 million more in 2019 than we had anticipated when we were putting together the 5-year financial direction last year. We anticipate about 1 million, or a third of the 3 million, is sustainable ongoing. And so we've built that into the 5-year financial direction for future years. So on the expenditure side, returning council members will be familiar with charts that look like this. This just breaks out the city, the dollars the city spends at a very high level. So from personnel costs, which are made up of salary, wages, and fringe benefits, on through the dollars that we spend contracting out and internally for our internal services, as well as our capital and debt. This year, I just wanted to show you 2018 as compared to 2019. You see that capital percentage grow, but in general, what the city spends its dollars on is pretty stable year to year. This chart is new, and the city is organized into 24 different departments, but they don't each get 4 to 5% of the city's budget. This is an all funds view, and looking at all funds and both the departments and then capital and debt are included here as well. Looking at public works, public safety, including both police and fire, our capital and debt, those activities alone make up 70% of city spending. And so we're pretty heavily tilted towards those things that I think people traditionally expect cities to provide: streets, good drinking water, and public safety. Were this disaggregated by fund, if we were looking just at the general fund, the picture would look quite different.
I have to say, Mr. Intermill, that the piece of this that strikes me the most is that the coordinator's office has grown to be nearly as much as our debt service or police over time.
So, Madam Chair, to that point, the coordinator here is the umbrella organization. So it's both the coordinator's office, as we refer to it colloquially, as well as all of the departments that fall under it. So finance, HR, IT.
Okay, that's helpful.
The convention center is the only so-called coordinator department that's been pulled out, and that's just given its size and the different nature of the work.
Oh, I'm sorry. Councilmember Goodman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I remember a day when debt service was 20% of the overall budget, and we've worked really hard to bring it down. I'm wondering if you can give us a sense of what an average, what do the rating agencies consider a legitimate amount of debt service for the city to have in order to maintain our credit rating? I mean, I understand, because I've been behind building the new building, so we're going to have more debt as a result of that, but I'm wondering, where do we fall within the sweet spot? Obviously, 20% is terrible. That's why we spent so many years trying to bring it down.
Mr. Ruff.
Madam Chair, Councilmember Goodman. I'm Mark Ruff, the city CFO. Generally, I think the dimension of fixed costs that rating agency look at and they've changed their regulatory paradigm a little recently to include pension costs to be treated exactly the same as debt service. So as the council is aware, when those changes occur, Moody's does not look favorably upon the city. Fitch has changed such that they see that the city is heavily weighted on fixed costs, which is primarily related to our pension costs, which is primarily related to closed pension funds, which Mr. Inemo mentioned earlier. So that's what we're swimming a little upstream on overall. Those Standard & Poor's has us solidly in the AAA zone, and part of the reason they do is because they recognize that not only is debt service a smaller percentage, as you mentioned, of our overall budget, but also we pay off our debt very quickly. And so that's a helpful metric for us to be measured against when we look at others. We're selling debt that goes away in 2 or 3 years for most of our street projects, as opposed to 10 or 15 years. But a very short answer is to be in that 10 to 15% range is a very good place to be.
Thank you. Any other questions? Councilmember Reich.
Since the issue of bond rating has been mentioned, I know reserves are a key factor in that. I know we're very solid in that range, or at least that's my assumption. Is that still the area or the space that we're in from their perspective, or have they had policy changes on their end?
Madam Chair, Councilmember Reich, you're absolutely right. Part of the reason that we maintain that AAA rating with Standard & Poor's is because they look not only at our general fund balance, which is 17% of our general fund expenditures, but we get bonus points in the score. I mean, everything in rating agencies scored now. It's a very public, transparent process. And we get bonus points in the scoring system by the fact that we have available cash that's more than 75% of our general fund expenditures. And that available cash comes from a number of these pots of money, and we will maintain that bonus points even after if the mayor's budget as recommended were adopted, we would still be well in excess of that.
Thank you.
So moving on to current service level budgeting, I think it's important that we talk about that definition because it is so core to the growth that we see. As I mentioned, in our general fund, we're seeing 2/3 of the increase is related to the current service level. So really what current service level budgeting is about is planning for today's staffing and internal service levels at tomorrow's costs. So some forms of government will say if your budget in 2018 was $1 million, you start in 2019 at $1 million. And what we're saying is, regardless of what 2018 was, we're going to look and see what's your staffing level, what's your where are your fleet levels, your IT, your rent. What's that going to cost in 2019, and that's where we're starting from. So in general, current service level, again, is growing by about 3.5%. 2.7% is what we're seeing in the increase to personnel costs. And in the mayor's speech, he had mentioned our good experience, our positive experience with our self-insurance for medical. We had anticipated this personnel increase being at about 3%. But because of our move to self-insurance and our really good claims experience that we saw in the first year, rather than a 7% increase for health insurance, which is what our consultants at Deloitte had suggested we plan on, we're seeing a 1% increase there. And so this is another one of the success stories in the 2019 budget as it relates to the management of the city. The internal services then are at about 4% growth overall. IT and fleet and workers' comp, those are all around that 4%. Rent sticks out a little bit here, and that's because we did add on some additional leases. I think one of the primary new facilities is a new property and evidence warehouse for the police department, and so that new activity, although we consider it part of current service just because we had a property and evidence warehouse, even though there's a new one. It does drive that cost increase up a little bit. So that's really the nuts and bolts of the budget. Now we'll move into the major changes for 2019. In years past, at this point, we've gone through and called out one by one each of the change items. This year I'm not going to do that simply because we've included more detail on those change items in your budget books this year. So you can look in the operating department sections, and rather than seeing 1 to 2 sentence write-up of a particular change, you'll see a 2 to 4 page write-up of a particular change. Also, if you look at the very end of the financial overview section of the document, there's a full listing there. Finally, departments will be coming in front of you over the next month, and they are all much better positioned to talk about the changes than I am. That said, I will present a bit of a summary here. So in total, the mayor has proposed additional spending of $6.4 million ongoing, $37 million one time, so a total of about $43 million. That compares to a much greater level of need indicated by departments. So departments had requested over $18 million ongoing be added. The vast majority of that is in the general fund, and they requested $46 million one time be added. And that was split more evenly across the general fund and other funds. To me, this I've said this before this year, and I'll say it again. I think it just continues to highlight the fact that the city is growing, and so demands for services are greater, and departments feel the need to keep pace with that. And second, city work is changing. As there is sort of a policy intransigence at the federal level and the state level that you all are left to solve some pretty hefty problems. And so this additional spending really represents department's best thinking on how to start to tackle some of that. So the sort of the cornerstone of the mayor's, certainly the speech that he provided last Wednesday, as well as the new investments that he's proposing, is in the area of affordable housing. So in total, in the 2019 budget, the mayor is proposing $53 million of investment in the area of affordable housing. $13 million of that is federal. So there was an article in the Star Tribune this morning that referenced a $40 million city contribution, so that's how we get there. $30 million of that contribution is new. So what you see in front of you is the one-time investments through community planning and economic development, both the sources side and the uses side of the ledger. So as the council president mentioned earlier, about $14 million of TIF pooling is being used to fund an acceleration of the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. About $750,000 of community development block grant program income. So those, when we use CDBG to make loans and those loans get repaid, that's the sort of program income that we see. So that amount is being used to support the homeownership rehab investment. And then the other $13 million in one-time investments are being funded through a combination of $10 million from the Nicollet Hotel block sale proceeds. So when the city sold that block, we are using $10 million of that sale for affordable housing. $1 million that had previously been transferred from the general fund to the value capture fund as seed funding for that project as it got off the ground. And $2.2 million likewise, this is related to that closed pension issue that I mentioned earlier. $2.2 million had previously been transferred to support the closed pensions that is now being recalled to the general fund for use.
Thank you. Just to take a quick pause, we have two questions. The first from Councilmember Schrader.
Thank you, Madam Chair. On the TIF pooling, that's a substantial amount. Like, what is that TIF pooling currently being spent on?
Phone a friend and see if
That's fine. I guess to explain my question, it's is that new TIF pooling, and if so, how? No, okay.
Mr. Ruff.
Madam Chair, Councilmember Schrader. So the city has several dozen TIF districts, right? There are state laws, Mr. Uno mentioned, that enables the city to use TIF from redevelopment TIF districts for affordable housing. And there's a specific provision, not just for Minneapolis, but for any city in the state that wants to use portions of those redevelopment districts. So we have built up some cash balances. So when we mentioned earlier about increasing special revenue, this is most of it is cash that is sitting in funds right now. So as Mr. Intermill mentioned, we could choose to pay off some of the obligations earlier and shut the districts down sooner, or use the state law provision to slightly extend the term of those TIF districts. A few of them are new revenues that are just associated with some of the growth in the TIF districts. And one of the biggest contributors to that increase is the consolidated TIF district, and this is the special legislation. This is one that's not available to every city. It's the extended TIF district, which has a hard stop in 2020 for the city. And because that TIF district encompasses much of, or not much of, but parts of downtown and parts of uptown, we've seen tremendous growth in those values, and that translates into more TIF revenues. That's actually just been a more recent experience. And so all of those factors together kind of bring the availability of TIF that we may otherwise not have known or had in the last 3 years, for example.
Thank you.
You might want to stay up there for a second. Councilmember Gordon?
Thank you. So it's because the consolidated TIF district is performing better. There's still enough money to pay the obligations that we were expecting to be able to pay from it. I believe we're still using that to fund our neighborhood community relations department and also the neighborhood organizations.
Correct. Madam Chair, Councilmember Gordon, and to pay off the Target Center original acquisition. So all of those things are being paid off, and we, in addition, if you recall, repaid the neighborhoods. That was an authorization of the previous council, and so it's really because of those value increases that we're able to accomplish all of those things. But as I said, that district has a hard stop in 2020, at the end of 2020, and also that special legislation gives rather broad authority to how to use that money that we don't have in some of these other TIF districts.
Right.
As well.
How much of the 14 million do you think comes from the consolidated district?
$10 million.
And then I'm also curious about the repurposing of the value capture seed funding. Repurposed from what?
Madam Chair, Councilmember Gordon, some of this is before my time, so you may remember better than what my information is, but there was originally a transfer made from general fund and development fund money of $4 million to the value capture, and I think the idea on that seed money was to potentially pay for costs that that would occur before revenues started to ramp up for that effort, and then the other was to pay for costs which may be outside that rather narrow geographic area that is outlined in state law as to where we can spend money. So that was the seed money. It was almost like a contingency money to help pay for that. Certainly Councilmember Reich has more information than I do on this. So I think this overall is not taking all of that $4 million, but is taking a majority of that $4 million because it was viewed more as contingency when we had plans in place, and that obviously efforts are still going on. That's still a very active project, but the need for some affordable housing funding was, at least my understanding of the mayor's proposal, more pressing than necessarily some of the contingency money that may be used over 4 or 5 or 6 years. And so that was the choice that was made.
Does this relate to the value capture near Nicollet Avenue?
Yes.
And I think that was the hope we were going to be able to use that for some kind of transportation funding.
Madam Chair, Councilmember Gordon, there is still, even after this, several $1 million of cash in that fund. In addition, we are collecting $7 million per year in new money every year for the value capture. So this, we still have adequate resources to help with whatever transit improvements that the council may want to take on. It was just that this money was originally general fund and development fund money, and so the idea was to pull some of that back and repurpose it for affordable housing uses.
And the new money that's coming in has more strings attached to it being spent right there along the corridor, correct? But
Madam
this
Chair,
is early
Councilmember
money.
Gordon, you're absolutely right.
Okay,
Yep.
thank you.
We have a couple more questions here. The first from Councilmember Goodman.
Oh, this is opening a big can of worms. I'm really glad we're doing this. First of all, how is the 10 million for the Affordable Housing Trust Fund that being paid for the base? So we committed to 10 million in city ordinance, and we used pooled TIF resources in the past. So we used some home, some HOP, well, we used various federal and state funds, and then we had to backstop that with pooled TIF. So what is the source of the first 10 million? I'm interested in that. That's my first question. My second question is, why aren't we using all of the repayment of the value capture, or what I would call the streetcar fund, the streetcar that's not happening fund, that we can collect $7 million a year? That's great, but we should repay ourselves for the money we put into it, since our hands are tied on that. And then the consolidated TIF district is neighborhood money, and they're going to say it's neighborhood money. I'm going to go after your thing too, Cam, so just be clear and pay attention. The consolidated fund is neighborhood money. That's NRP money and money to fund neighborhood organizations and other neighborhood-related priorities. So now essentially we're saying we're going to take some of that money and put it into this. So we're pitting neighborhoods and neighborhood uses against affordable housing, streetcars against affordable housing, right? And now we're also suggesting, I'm interested in hearing what the suggestion is for the first 10 million in the Affordable Housing Trust Fund if we're not using pooled TIF for that, because we've done that in the past, maybe 3 or 4 million a year to put it in perspective out of 10. So I've got my pen out. What's the first 10 million from?
Madam Chair, Councilmember Goodman, thank you for the question.
Go ahead.
Hard to parse them out, so I'll do my best.
In the interest of transparency, I want everyone to know that the neighborhoods are going to come after us and say, what do you mean you're taking our consolidated TIF district money?
Right. So first of all, to answer the question, we consulted with the city attorney's office before utilizing consolidated TIF district money and said, was it exclusively for neighborhood organizations? And I think the answer was no. It's fairly broadly written in state statute to encompass affordable housing. So I don't think the intention on part of the staff is to pit one thing against another at all. It's to how do we use the resources we have and accomplish all the goals that the mayor at least was putting forth. And as I mentioned before, the repayment to the neighborhood organizations was made. So I don't know.
But we promised there'd be a program going forward, and they're in the process of the Neighborhood 2020 planning process right now, and they're expecting that there will be money for neighborhoods, and that was the source. So maybe I should also hear how much money we're putting into neighborhoods and what the source is for that. But the first thing I'm interested in is the 10 million for the Affordable Housing Trust Fund.
Sure, and I would just say, Madam Chair, Councilmember Goodman, I think the long-term funding of neighborhoods is clearly an issue that I've heard from a number of you is a concern and would be solved not necessarily in this budget year, but in the next budget year, or perhaps the following. So,
well, once we spend all our one-time money, there won't be any money left to spend on that.
On the issue, Madam Chair, of the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, there is additional TIF money that's, just as in the past, is being utilized to assist with that, and the same ratios that was done before with CDBG. On page I-9 of the budget book is a schedule of the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, and these numbers are too small for me to read without my reading glasses, Micah, so you may have to help answer specifically that question. And then the third question I think I heard you say was on the value capture. Is that right? And why not we're using all of the seed money? I think, Madam Chair, Councilmember Goodman, the idea was, I think, if I recall correctly, it's 3 million out of the 4 million that's being utilized. And I think there was a recognition that
It says here $1 million.
right,
1 million repurposed value capture.
for the affordable housing, but there are also dollars that are used for the one-time funding that's outside of affordable housing that's in the mayor's budget. And so some of that is being used in more of the general fund expenditures, and I think it's 3 out of 4 million, if my memory serves me right. Can confirm that. The recognition, at least from a staff perspective, is the original intent of that still may be necessary, which is to fund some costs for planning as that keeps going, that are not within the narrow confines of the state law and that geographic boundary. So we wanted to leave some dollars that would accomplish the goals that have been laid out by the council. And as far as I know right now, current goal is the enhancement of transit along those corridors.
Well, okay. I mean, I understand we can't spend the value capture for anything other than the streetcar and the streetcar corridor. But what would be used if the streetcar, we've already picked the alignment, a lot of energy has gone into it. So what money would have to be spent outside the corridor to build a streetcar?
Madam Chair, I think I would have put that into the same category as detailed affordable housing questions, which is, it's a good question for our public works folks when they come for presentation. Certainly that would be one that we will alert them to address when they have their presentation to the council.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. We have another question from Councilmember Bender.
They didn't tell me.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I think this is probably also for the detailed presentation that CPED will be giving. But I just wanted to note that a lot of things that are focused on renter protections and support for renters have been funded with one-time dollars for many years in a row, or for a handful of years in a row at least. So the tenant hotline funds, legal protections, and I see that they're again proposed as one-time funds. So I just wanted to note that. I think if we start to see things funded with one-time dollars for like 4 or 5 or more years in a row, maybe they really are ongoing expenses, and we should probably be accounting for those expenses with ongoing funds. So I don't know if we were able to balance this budget. I mean, these are not large amounts of money in the context of the whole budget, but there may be other examples of this. I know a lot of the violence prevention money we've been funding with one-time dollars year by year, and I'm just interested, generally speaking, in looking at the examples of this kind of spending that's happening with one-time dollars for many years in a row, and looking if we can't be more sustainable and honest in how we're funding them with ongoing dollars.
Madam Chair, Council President, I think that's a very good point. And I think that particularly when we're in an annual budget environment, one-time expenditures get very confusing and very muddy very quickly. And so even if the budget document called out funding for a particular program as one time in 1 year, there's absolutely a sense of loss for whoever's either running or benefiting from that program if it's not continued in the next year. So I think it's a very good point, and something that we as a city could find a little bit more discipline in terms of how many years in a row can something be a pilot, or how many years in a row is something eligible for one-time funding before it's not. Again, on the other side, I don't know that one-time funding is particularly, I think we're seeing more one-time funding today because we're in that growth environment in the economy. And so as we want to continue to take advantage of a growth environment, we also don't want to limit ourselves in terms of the kind of expenditures that we want to make. So, I mean, I think these are all really good points that you're making, and certainly things that we can come back with a staff recommendation on.
Thank you. Before I move to the next question, I just wanted to point out that this is part of the benefit of looking at budgets longer term than we currently do. Instead of every year dealing with the incremental change and trying to kick in a couple of one-time funding to keep something else going, I think it really deserves digging into the details and being involved and concerned as a council with the results Minneapolis work going on that should be consistent over time. And we're working very hard to improve that program. So it is my hope that with a better performance management indicator and time as a council to dig into the rest of what we do as a city instead of the incremental change each year, that we are able to better make decisions about that type of thing in a more robust way than we have in the past. So with that, Councilmember Schrader.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to highlight what the council president said. I mean, a lot of what she talked about, this is one-time funding, and it just begs the question of why don't we have a dedicated fund for housing? If this is something critical to the city, all of these, unless we're expecting renters to go away, we need to continue to fund them every year. And that's much, much easier when we're being honest with taxpayers and honest with our city that this is a commitment
That's an important point. I don't know that if there's a question, it more of an emphasis, right?
Yep, let's go emphasis.
Okay. Councilmember Jenkins.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So to that point around sustainability and also the data, I mean, I see these sort of one-term processes and projects or spending as a way to sort of see if these programs are work before we fully invest resources. But I think what drives the investment has to be data. And so you brought up the results and Minneapolis, and I'm not sure if I'm understanding how that process is working. You mentioned that we're trying to improve that.
I'm going to have Mr. Intermill speak to it. Actually, Andrea Larson could probably speak even better to it, but this has been a huge lift for a while. And go ahead.
Madam Chair, Council Vice President, I think I absolutely agree that the data driving the investments is not only the way of the world, but also what I've heard many of you talk about. With respect to results, over the last several years, the coordinator's office has been working to make that program more robust and sort of meaningful for both departments and all of you as policymakers. And so they are, rather than looking at a laundry list of performance measures, instead engage in a conversation with council about what specific one or two things with each department are you interested in looking at and having a more robust conversation on. And so that's the results conferences themselves. At the same time, we're doing a lot of work to align results in the budget so that the two don't operate independent of each other. And so the primary way we've accomplished that this year is departments are, if they're not already reporting their results by budget program area, they are to begin that process this year and into next, so that year over year we can look at not only what are we planning to spend, but what have we actually spent on the activities that we're measuring performance against. The other thing I'll say about performance measurement and budgeting is that results, I think, was a very effective tool, not only for the city of Minneapolis, but I think Baltimore is really what made results cool. The eras that the programs popped up under were in times of financial need and constraint and needing to cut to a particular target. And I think results is really effective in answering those questions. In this growth environment we're in, and we won't always be in it, but the one we're in now and as future economic expansions occur, I think program evaluation is actually a better tool to help us understand what's working today, what could we change differently about what we're doing to achieve better results. And so I think there's also a conversation going on there between both finance and property services and the coordinator's office to see how we can get there and really improve our portfolio of management tools.
Yeah, I just have to, I think that's critical to addressing Council President Bender and Councilmember Schrader's concerns about how, when do we make sustainable investments instead of sort of this piecemeal approach.
Yeah, so just to say, if we are noticing that a always one-time funded program, it's never quite as clear-cut as that, but if there's something that gets one-time funding every year that shows that we are making a real difference with that money over time, then that should become a priority for ongoing funding. And it's as simple as that, but being able to look at the budget from a program evaluation perspective is what's been really interesting with this Results Minneapolis work we've been undertaking. So I look forward to sharing more of that. And I know you all have been engaged in your respective committees on that, and I appreciate that the council president added Enterprise having its own home committee, because that's where we do some of this important work. So,
I think the only other thing I'll add on the topic is 2 days from now, council will be starting the first day of a 2-day session to hone and identify and codify the priorities for this term and the first year of the next term. And so I think that looking through those priority areas at both the work that's core to what we do as a city, either because it's legally required or because it's just the work of a city and we have to do it, or the work that we choose to do, looking at that through that strategic priority lens will also help to identify what are the programs not only that are working well, but the programs we want to continue to achieve those policy outcomes that are important to you all as council as well as the mayor.
Councilmember Bender.
Thank you, Madam Chair. If we were to shift, say, $14 million into ongoing funds, or even $3-4 million into ongoing funds from this one time, what would be the impacts of that on the budget?
Madam Chair and Council President, that's an interesting question that you may have seen my head explode a little bit as I was trying to come up with an answer quickly. I think when looking at our ongoing budget and our one-time budget, though they live in the same document, come from different sources. And so I think to move some of this investment to an ongoing position, that would require doing less of either some of our base ongoing work or the additional $6 million that the mayor has prioritized in his recommendation.
Councilmember Gordon.
Well, we could also simply move some of that to one-time spending. We could decide we want this $14 million for affordable housing ongoing. Let's take $14 million and try that as one time.
Councilmember, I appreciate that I fell into the classic trap of an either or, and you presented a great third way. So thank you.
And I'm not necessarily advocating that, but
We'll have our conversation about what a structurally sound budget is another time, I guess. Without any other questions before us right away, we'll let you get back to your presentation.
So moving on to our next slide, and at the risk of repeating the conversation that we just had about one-time versus ongoing, this shows sort of the base or ongoing investments made in affordable housing. Some of these are indeed one-time recurring expenditures, such as the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. Some of these are new ongoing investments, such as the expansion of the 4D program. And there's a mix here of both general fund and non-general fund. In this $18 million that you see at the bottom, $9 million comes from federal sources, which I believe is important to the affordable housing conversation. So in total on affordable housing, we have the $28.5 million one-time investment, the $18.5 million ongoing or base investment, about $2 million of spending that comes outside of CPED. All of the programs you've seen on the last two slides are just in CPED. So things like housing inspections that are added with a particular emphasis on the high occupancy buildings. 2 or 3 were added last year, and another 2 are being added this year. So that's part of that $2 million. Plus $4 million in federal tax credits that are allocated by the city is how we come up to that $53 million total investment in affordable housing, $13 million of it being federal.
Yes, Councilmember Goodman is.
Can you explain to me the $4 million in federal tax credits allocated by the city? Is that a 9% tax credits? We're getting an increase in our allocation. Is it the 4% tax credits and bonds? Is that an increase in the allocation? None of it capitalizes into equity that we give to developers. So it's not really an amount we put into something. So help me understand what $4 million in federal tax credits allocated by the city means specifically.
So, Madam Chair, Councilmember Goodman, this does take into account both the 4% and 9% program, and it's not an expansion. This is just the estimate of the annual payment or tax credit that's allocated by the city to the developers.
That can't be. I mean, we get like 40 million in 4% tax credits and about 1.2 million in 9% tax credits, neither of which, to me, I don't understand what the 4 million is specifically.
Mr. Ruff.
Madam Chair, Councilmember Goodman, I think this chart again shows existing and new, right? So the 4%, 9% are part of the existing line items. And the idea is those are annual allocations that are offered to the city, which then developers take and put equity to, right?
I understand how tax credits work.
I understand. I'm just providing some context that just says this is a way of at least trying to demonstrate what is a federal resource versus a city resource, and what is the annual allocation from the federal government that comes through the city to help with affordable housing.
But that makes no sense to me. We get like 36 million in 4% tax credits. Is this an additional 4 on the 36 we get?
So I believe
We get about 1.2 in 9% tax credits. Is this an additional, that'd be great if it was, I'm sure it's not, an additional 4 to the 1.2 we get?
Madam Chair, I certainly can have, I mean, offline, technically, we consulted with CPED staff, and so we can certainly give you more detailed information, but the allocation is bonds, it's not tax credits for the 4%, and those bonds do not translate dollar for dollar into tax credits. So that's the difference, I think, in the math that you're presenting.
I just don't know if I don't understand what the 4 million is. I don't understand which pool it's in.
Sure.
And
Madam Chair, I think if it's appropriate, Councilmember Goodman, we can work with CPED housing staff and get the information to you that we arrived at this. It's admittedly an imperfect way of presenting it, but it is the best way we could come up with to try to demonstrate what are federal resources that come through the city to help with affordable housing.
I'm just making a note of that, and we'll be including it on our follow-up notes to CPED in terms of their budget conversation, but I hope they can work offline and we can come up with something that's knowable, shareable, all of that. We have another question from Councilmember Schrader.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to follow up on that. I'm very interested to see that analysis, because my main worry is that you're putting a dollar amount around something that's not money.
that we get to allocate, right?
So I think this probably deserves a separate conversation, but go ahead, Mr.
I understand, Madam Chair, Councilmember Schrader, I appreciate your comment, but much like we allocate CDBG, I mean, we pass through on that as well, some of which goes to affordable housing. That this was the same spirit of trying to capture some value there. So I think they are real dollars that the city allocates that then private entities can leverage and bring other sources to. So that was the effort. And again, admittedly imperfect, I will just say that.
Oh, no, I get that. I think some of my bias is I don't count federal dollars as much. It's very easy for me to give away other people's money. And I think that's is a separate thing. I think it's accurate. I'm not trying to say that, but I think it's just viewed a little bit differently when it's other people's.
Understood.
So some of the other major change areas contained within the mayor's recommended budget, the first being public safety. The mayor's talked about a number of investments in community police relations across multiple departments. I think a good one to highlight is the group violence intervention program. This is actually one of those previously one-time funded programs that the mayor has included ongoing funding for, as well as some one-time funding for a pilot of an expansion into additional areas beyond the original that were served. In addition, I think as compared to the last several years' budgets, the mayor is not recommending additional sworn officers through this budget. However, he is recommending the conversion of 8 positions currently filled by sworn officers to be civilian-held positions. So what that means is the sworn count will remain 888 if you adopt the recommendation as proposed, but it makes room for 8 more officers to be on the street as opposed to working in an administrative position.
Councilmember Bender.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I've heard this described different ways, so I think it's just another place to be clear about what's happening. So it's not, I mean, I guess we are adding funds, $1 million, to hire 8 new people who are civilians. Okay. So it's not like we're taking 8 positions and using the $800,000 or $1 million currently used to pay their salaries and converting those positions to civilian positions, or adding staff. And instead of being sworn officers, as was planned and assumed in previous years, they're civilians instead.
So, Madam Chair, Council President, we are, to the first point that you made, adding $1 million to hire 8 additional FTE, absolutely. The intent is for those 8 FTE to fill 8 existing positions that are currently filled by sworn officers, so that sworn officers can instead be doing public safety policing duties out on the street.
Why does it cost $1 million to add 8 staff that are currently assumed
So,
in the FTE count?
Madam Chair, Council President, that's a great question. Some of it is purchasing additional squads so that as those officers get back out on the street, they can get around. And so if you, the change item is both personnel and non-personnel in nature.
It'd be helpful to know how much of it is the sort of squad and materials costs for adding those officers to the street versus any other costs.
Sorry.
Is all of the millions of the $1 million, is it all for the costs of adding those officers to the street?
Yes, Madam Chair. Yeah, and I think to directly answer your question, that the net effect is indeed adding 8 more positions to the police department. It's just the difference between a sworn position and a non-sworn.
Mr. Ruff, did you want to add anything?
I have great sympathy for Mr. Intermill because of this rapid fire question, but I just want to be clear. Overall, this is an increase in FTE count in the police department.
By 8?
By 8. So I think it's a combination of the salaries and then the dollars that Mr. Intermill mentioned about other costs related for sworn on the street. But it is an increase in FTE overall in the police department, which I think was the confusion that I heard.
Thank you. And I've heard this described different ways, and so we may have our opinions about what's proposed, but I think it's helpful to just understand better what's proposed. So.
And Madam Chair, this is, again, another one of those areas that we'll make sure that the police department's ready to explain crystal clear. So the last investment under the public safety category is an additional 5 fire personnel related both to the opening of, I believe I'm saying it right, Station 1 downtown, as well as continuing to look at the mobile health care provider program, the discussion that was started in last year's budget. The next major grouping of changes is economic inclusion, looking to grow the city's economy through making it more inclusive. The mayor talked at length in his speech about a $500,000 investment for the Village Trust Financial Cooperative, which is aims to be the city's only Black-led financial institution. In the 2018 budget, the year we're currently in, I have to remind myself that constantly as I'm going back and forth in time. We have included a $50,000 investment with Village Trust, and I happen to be the manager of that contract with the organization, and they just submitted a progress report, which was glowing, and they're really doing a very good job of advancing towards their goals of getting a federal credit union charter and being able to expand access to capital to a large portion of our population that has had a lot of systemic barriers to that capital. So that's the $500,000 investment there. In addition, as council passed some additional workplace protections over the last few years, including sick and safe time and minimum wage. The mayor has recommended adding an investigator to the Labor Standards Enforcement Division in the Civil Rights Department, as well as investing in a collaborative enforcement pilot, which will seeks to contract with organizations that support both the small business community and the low-wage worker community, so that everybody really understands the rules of the road as it relates to these policies, so that hopefully there's less enforcement from the city and more sort of voluntary compliance just by virtue of folks understanding what the rules are. Additionally, the mayor has recommended some continued one-time investment in the workforce development centers, both Cedar Riverside Opportunity Center and 800 West Broadway. And he has also recommended about $200,000 in the city coordinator's office to have monies ready for a municipal ID program as soon as details and timing is right there. And the last place I'll highlight in terms of two last places I'll highlight in terms of major changes. One is the Parks and Streets plan, which Council President asked about early on this afternoon. That continues to be fully funded as planned. But also a number of investments in improved city operations, which seek to help us do the work that we do at the city better. So additional staffing and program dollars in the city coordinator's office for racial equity, a new budget system that helps us be more transparent and for the information to be more accessible for all of you as policymakers as well as your constituents, additional staffing for supplier diversity within our procurement team, a records asset inventory system, which sounds about as wonky as you can get. Basically, this is digital system that helps us understand what's in the tower so that we know where our historical records are, which are currently now known by one person in the city, which is a different conversation for a different day.
We can't tell you who.
But related to that, also some strategies around paper reduction so that we don't find ourselves in a situation where we are reliant on paper documents where we don't have to be, and also so that we're in a position to move people into that new public service building as opposed to file boxes into the building. And then finally, a small amount for some continuity of operations planning software through the Office of Emergency Management, so that if the worst is to happen and there's an emergency, we are able to get back online and keep delivering services for the folks who live, work, and play in the city of Minneapolis.
I do want to ask a question on that, but first, Councilmember Jenkins has a question or comment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Intermill, are there specific dollar amounts for these changes, or is that going to be determined at some point in the future? And I'm specifically curious about additional staffing and program dollars supporting racial equity.
So, Madam Chair and Council Vice President, I'm quickly turning to find the right page in the budget document. But as I mentioned, there's a detailed listing of all change items in the financial overview section of your budget book, starting on page B14, as well as detail about how those dollars are being spent within each department. So specific to, I'm sorry, it was the racial equity staffing and program dollars that you had asked about. And it's $150,000 on time for that item, including 1 FTE. But again, all of those items do have associated dollar amounts, and they are in that budget document.
Thank you.
Mr. Intermill, I just wanted to confirm that the details of the continuity planning, that is a recurring theme that we see through almost all of our audit work in terms of the city having a robust both risk analysis and also just continuity planning in our city. Does it have more information that I haven't gotten to yet in the continuity planning and under emergency management, or is that amount just purely for major disaster contingency work?
Madam Chair, the amount that's being recommended for appropriation to the Office of Emergency Management for this item is for software to help departments build those continuity of operation plans so that there's both consistency in approach and consistency in record. And I think in an emergency, having clear records that we can turn to and understand how those documents work is of vital importance, and I'm sure that Mr. Lane will speak more to that.
Super, thank you.
So with a half hour left of our time, we are to the property tax impact section in the home stretch of our presentation. The mayor's recommendation for 2019 is a 5.63% increase to the overall Minneapolis levy. So earlier I said we were just talking about the city. We'd get to a point where we were also talking about the independent boards. Now's that time. So that 5.63% is inclusive of an increase both to the Minneapolis Park Board as well as the Board of Estimate and Taxation. The pie chart, well, the table on the left of your presentation shows just the change from 2018 to 2019, both in dollar amounts and percentage. The pie chart on the right shows just by entity, where is it that our property tax dollars go? About 77% or 3/4 of those property tax dollars go to the city, be that the general fund, the levy we have that supports our contribution to the MBC, the bond redemption fund, the closed pension obligations. About 19% of the levy support goes to the park board. 3% goes to the library referendum, which is when the city and county came to an agreement to consolidate library operations into the county. We took on some debt at that time that we're still retiring. And 1% goes to the Teachers Retirement Association. That's not a typo. When the Minneapolis Teachers Retirement Association merged into the TRA several years ago, I was talking to Jack Qualley earlier today, and he couldn't remember the exact date, but he thought it was in the early 2000s. When that merger happened, like with the MRF and para merger, there was an unfunded portion of the Minneapolis teachers' retirement that we were that retirement plan was required to pay back over time, or pay into over time. As legislative agreements go, at some point along the way, somebody remembered that the Minneapolis schools used to be part of the city of Minneapolis, and so the city of Minneapolis got to contribute a little bit to that funding solution. So we still levy about $2.3 million a year to that effort. It's just an interesting foible of the city's budget.
If I could just pause for a second, Council Vice President Jenkins.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Neville, and I think you alluded to this, but the library referendum,
Yes.
is that specifically for Hennepin County libraries in Minneapolis, or is that for the broader county system?
So, Madam Chair, Council Vice President, this predates my time, but I think it was related to the Central Library downtown, conferring with Mr. Ruff.
Mm-hmm.
So, Council Vice President, as a part of the merger, we had an operational obligation that was phased out. I think in last year was the last year of the operating subsidy to the county. And then there was a referendum that was passed for not only the Central Library, but also neighborhood library improvements when the city owned the libraries. And that is the debt service. So it's Minneapolis, to answer your question, Minneapolis only libraries, and it is the debt service that was associated with that original referendum, which included primarily the new Central Library, but also neighborhood library improvements. And so that debt is carrying forward. That's the debt that we will pay for the next 3-4 years, and that will phase out, and we will replace that debt with the debt service for the new consolidated office building.
Yay. So Then my other question, and you alluded to this as well, but the schools, the referendum for schools does not
So,
factor into this calculation?
Madam Chair, Council Vice President, no, the school board levy and the current referendum that's being discussed are not a part of this 5.63% increase. The 5.63 is only for the entities and functions that you see here.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Council President Bender.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I should know this and remember, but the change that's reflected in the park board's levy, is this incorporating the Parks and Streets funding? And I know that I ask partly because I know that the park board has talked to me and probably my colleagues about looking for increased funds for programming this year. And so I just wondered how much that's reflected here or not.
Madam Chair, Council President, that's a very good question. Thank you for raising it. So the agreement that was forged in 2016 for the Parks and Streets assumed a 4% annual increase to the park board levy. What you're seeing in front of you is a 5.53% increase. So it does include an amount beyond what had been planned for in the 5-year financial direction. That 5.53% is $950,000 that the mayor is including room for. It's a little bit technical, but the mayor doesn't recommend or set the park board levy because the park board does that. But he has included room for that in his recommendation of the overall city levy. $950,000 is made up of $800,000 for current operations, current service level, and $150,000 for additional youth programming in I'm going to get the name wrong, but community school program that's also related to the parks. So there is that additional $150,000 of programming. I think the park board will come to the BET in September with their recommended levy, and then it will be up to not only the two folks who are sitting before me who are on the BET, but also the rest of the members of the BET to come to that final maximum levy that's set, which could be in excess or lower than the mayor's recommendation of 5.63%.
So just to be clear, the number that the park board was talking about was significantly higher than 150,000 additional dollars. They may pass a budget that reflects more and then would go to the BET to look for that added additional levy over what's been proposed here.
Madam Chair, Council President, that's absolutely right. So looking at the 2019 taxes payable, this just shows where we are seeing the change in value in different parcels in the city, and far and away industrial parcels are increasing fastest in value, followed by apartments and residential and commercial. We had talked about the closed pension, so I won't hammer on that too hard, other than to say I had suggested that there could be a date and time in the future where the state had reduced their portion of coming to full funding on the for MRF. That date is currently set in state law to happen in fiscal year 2020. Prior to that, it was supposed to happen in fiscal year 2018, and so our intergovernmental relations team is working, has been working, continues to work with the state legislature to make sure that the state fulfills its end of the bargain. However, if that doesn't come to pass, we are the mayor's recommending an increase to the closed pension, the levy to support the closed pensions by $1 million this year, and in each of the next few years. You'll see that in the 5-year financial direction. In addition, so as we were just talking about the park board levy and an increase or a placeholder there for an increase of about $1 million, it was important for me to note that the mayor's recommendation for the city general fund levy is about $1 million less than what's included in the 5-year financial direction. And that's in order to leave room for the park board while still being under the 5.65% that was recommended that was adopted in the 5-year financial direction. That $1 million reduction of the general fund had to take place. So this chart just shows over time the change to the Minneapolis property tax levy, again, including the independent boards. The average growth rate year over year is about 5%. Similar to that, since 2002, the trend for single-family homes, obviously in this chart you see a nice trough there, which represents the housing crisis of 2008, 2009, which then bled into subsequent years as property taxes lag a little bit. The average rate of return on a single-family home has been about 3%. Excuse me, 3.3. Though we are seeing an overall market value increase and an increase to the average or median valued home of 10% comparing 2018 to 2019. So home values are increasing quite a bit. New construction value represents less than 2% of that overall increase. So really, truly, it is inflation in the marketplace that's driving that overall market value. Other factors we talk about, there's what the property tax levy increase percentages, and there's what it feels like to the property taxpayer. Other things that influence the feels like factor are the market value exclusion program, are often referred to as the homestead tax credit. If you live in the home that you own, a portion of the value is excluded from the tax calculation, and as your home value grows, that exclusion is smaller and smaller as a percentage. You'll see more on the next slide how that actually impacts the estimated property tax bills. I'm going to skip fiscal disparities and go down to TIF. Just suggest that our new construction value, if it's that new construction is in a TIF district, the general fund doesn't benefit, the TIF district benefits, and the agreements that we've come to with to have those parcels develop see the benefit in the immediate. I think, as I've said to a few of you before, depending on whether you're talking with Mr. Ruff or myself, you get a very different flavor for property taxes because of our backgrounds, me coming from the state where we deal very little with property tax, and him coming from the private consulting industry and his vast depth. So anticipating questions, I'm going to have him come up and talk through the fiscal disparities program and its impact on the city.
Thank you. This is a perfect place to do it.
Madam Chair, I don't think there's any pride in knowing a lot about the property tax system. It's not something that I go home and talk a lot about with my family, but I will do my best to answer the question raised by Councilmember Goodman earlier about fiscal disparities and the impact on the city. So fiscal disparities system that was set up in the early 1970s as a tax-based sharing. It was actually set up by a Republican primary author from Anoka, a gentleman named Representative Weaver, and whose family is still well known in politics today. Mr. Weaver believed that we shouldn't be encouraging businesses to chase low tax rates, and so we should try to set up a system where we equalize tax rates for businesses, and then also to benefit places like Anoka that may not get an infrastructure investments that attracts commercials, so they should get at least compensated by being more of a bedroom community than a commercial community. So that at least was the overview among other policy goals of sharing property tax base among all cities. So as Mr. Inamo mentioned, they're oftentimes parsed out between net contributors and net beneficiaries for the fiscal disparity system. And for a number of years, the city of Minneapolis was actually a net beneficiary. So we actually received $2-3 million a year of net revenues that we otherwise wouldn't have had up until as recently as 2013 as a city. But since 2013, because our commercial value, not just new construction, but overall value has increased so dramatically, what happens with fiscal disparities is 40% of that value goes to the pool. And We obviously receive a little bit of an increase from that pool, but very little increase. So in other words, we are sending largely 40% of the commercial industrial value increase to a pool. Honestly, one of the main beneficiaries of that system right now is the city of St. Paul. And so one of the reasons that because they have not seen that same kind of commercial, either new construction or value increase, part of what the formula for how much you receive out of that pool is not just commercial tax-based growth, but overall tax-based growth. And so certainly Minneapolis has done well. Again, this is a bell curve system to try to balance out. And so we are doing better than the majority of the metro area. So we have surpassed what have traditionally been the highest total dollar, not per capita, but total dollar contributors, which have been places like Bloomington and Minnetonka and Edina and Eden Prairie. So we have surpassed it. So we are now the largest net contributor to the fiscal disparity system. So the system is not subject to annual calculations by any legislative body, the Met Council body or the state. It is an automated formula with somebody in a spreadsheet in Anoka County who is still the administrator for this system. So what does that mean for us now? So as I said, we traditionally had received a net benefit of $2 to $3 million a year. Now it is costing us, essentially costing us generally. We are contributing about $9.5 million to our tax revenue. So if fiscal disparities did not exist, we would have for 1 year anyway, a 3% lower levy for those, at least to put that in real dollar terms. I've not seen the net numbers on a comparison basis for 2019 yet, so I don't know, where we fall and how much St. Paul has benefited compared to last year. I did read a news report that said the St. Paul net benefit is over something like 20 or 25%. So they are, but again, that's an uneven revenue source, one that is not easily can be counted on for long periods of time. So it's a system that's worked well from the standpoint of helping to even out tax disparities among the metropolitan area, but certainly we are in a phase now where we're doing better compared to the metropolitan area. That again might change someday. So that's the net result. I don't know, Councilmember Goodman, if you had anything else, but yes. Madam Chair, Councilmember Goodman, you are right. I don't know if currently that is the case. There have also been exemptions, a few exemptions for TIF districts not having to pay in and I think that might be the latest Mall of America exemption. There was originally a loan from the fiscal disparities pool that helped paid for some of the infrastructure associated with the original Mall of America. That loan has been repaid, but that was one of the few times where anybody ever dipped into this pool for something other than what its original purpose was.
I want to recognize Councilmember Fletcher with a question or comment.
Thank you, Chair Palmisano. I just want to make sure that I understand properly. So this only applies to commercial and industrial property. Is that right? So the fiscal disparities doesn't take money out of whatever increases in the property tax base come out of housing?
Chair Palmisano, for the Councilmember Fletcher, for the contributions, that is true. Okay, but how much money we get back from the pool? So we get a fair amount of money back from the pool. I think $30-some million, $34 million or something from the pool. So how much that increases or decreases is based on our overall per capita market value, which does include residential and commercial. So it's a two-phase calculation. One is how much you send in, and it's independent calculation on how much you receive back. So it's only on how much you send in that's related to commercial and industrial.
Okay, so then just to clarify, on the contribution side, we contribute some portion of whatever commercial and industrial growth we experience, or some portion of our commercial and industrial market value. But if it grows, we still keep some of it, correct? I just want to,
Correct.
We're not kicking 100%.
We're not getting
of our...
less this year than we received last year from the pool, but it's, we're increasing substantially our amount, and we're only getting like $100,000 more this year out of it. Yep.
Great. And then on the beneficiary side, we receive more money
if our values are going up, or it's inversely proportional?
Inverse.
Okay, thank you.
Council Vice President Jenkins.
Thank you, Chair Palmisano and Mr. Rupp. My comments are in no way to speak ill of the fiscal disparities process. I think it is fair. I just want to highlight for my colleagues that our own budget does not have these same values in it related to equity in our city. And so I think we need to think about how are we addressing the disparities in our community that are born primarily by communities of color, and really creating a value statement with our budget to address those disparities.
Thank you for that comment. Councilmember Goodman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Ruff, thank you for really simplistically explaining that. My point being that we're putting in $9 million into the state pool. We also take on some of the greatest challenges and disparities of any city in the state as well. So we are offering, because of our values, to house the homeless and raise the minimum wage and make sure our streets are good and fight for transit and do all of the things that align with our values to the best of our ability, while we're giving communities that don't want to grow a benefit. And I think that's troublesome. It's also troublesome as it pertains to sales tax, where we pay into the state a lot more in sales tax, a lot more than we keep for ourselves. And I'll lastly chime in on the TIF situation. Capturing tax increment to put it into something else basically suppresses property value growth that would go into our general fund budget. So, I mean, you're not only bringing in a whole bunch more people who need services, you're giving that money to developers to build those buildings, and now we're also going to be pooling it for affordable housing, and we're pooling it for a streetcar. That takes it out of the larger pie to spend on the things that we think are priorities, or at least our budget reflects as it pertains to priorities. So if we keep eating up, we lose money through fiscal disparities, we don't get as much in sales tax revenue, and then we're creating a whole bunch of new TIF districts. We're not really growing our city and benefiting from it, and people are strained by some of this growth. Maybe I'm the only one thinking that some of the growth is a strain on people who are here, but we're not really. I heard a story this morning on NPR on gentrification. Many of you probably heard it, and one of the things that was said is, the city is unapologetic about wanting to increase our tax base. Well, we should be somewhat apologetic since we're not keeping all the money from growing our tax base. So it's hard to push that growth on people that often results in gentrification when we're not even benefiting from it in order to redistribute it to more closely mirror our values. So that's why I brought the issue up, because I think that we're trying to do the best we can, but there are a lot of forces outside that are trying to tell us we should do a lot less with a lot less.
Chair Palmisano, I appreciate the comments of Councilmember Goodman. I do want to say that TIF is one of the areas where we can leverage other dollars. Specifically, the state law allows us to capture not only our taxes, but also the county portion of taxes on a new building, and really the state dollars. So I'm just saying that all of these points in discussion of property tax are different layers of the pie, some of which kind of work at cross purposes, and others where we're trying to, we're giving to the metropolitan area, and other places where we're trying to utilize resources from the rest of the metropolitan area. And at least I understand the double-edged sword of a TIF district, but it does leverage other dollars that we otherwise wouldn't have in a general fund budget from that same
Mr. Ruff,
property.
though, some would say stealing other dollars from schools, parks, county services, homelessness services, social services, those monies would have gone to those jurisdictions to do the same sort of work that we're doing at their level. We're just taking their money from parks, from schools, from counties, and using it for what we think is more important, rather than letting them, the other units of government, decide what's more important. So there are two edges to that sword also.
That's a policy choice, Madam Chair, Council. I just wanted to point out the math. I didn't really want to get into the policy side of it, but I appreciate the exchange in any case. So.
Council President Bender.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think, I think this raises a lot of important questions. And one thing I just wanted to note while we're talking about this is, our city is not growing equally, and I mean that word literally, across the city. So very dense neighborhoods like the ones that I represent, or in the 3rd Ward or in the 7th Ward, which already have a higher population density today, are growing. And so I think I have been very supportive of, and continue to be, and think we should be even more aggressive about using race equity as a center of how we make infrastructure investments. But I also think we're doing a very bad job as a city of preparing the infrastructure investments that we need to support population growth in already dense neighborhoods. So I agree with what Councilmember Goodman just said. My constituents feel the pressure of having thousands of new residents in neighborhoods that are the most dense already in our city, with no additional transit access, with no additional amenities provided. We went back in on the back end and are rebuilding 29th Street as an amenity for the thousands of new people who live along the Greenway. But my constituents absolutely feel that pressure. And so I think as we're looking forward, and people have their opinions about the comprehensive plan, but one of my perspectives representing a ward that is both very dense and that is growing is that I think we need to do a better job of directing our resources into those neighborhoods that are growing. And if we are going to continue, which the current draft proposal does, and concentrating most of the growth in very small percentage of our land area around transit, I think we need to take a really careful look at our policy and priorities. And again, I want to reemphasize that I'm not suggesting we back away from our race equity commitments, and there is probably a push and pull there. Some of our lowest density neighborhoods are also places that we want to invest because of a race equity lens. But I also think that we need to be really clear about where we are building, where we're welcoming new growth, and how we are planning for the infrastructure needs of the constituents that live there today and in the future, and particularly in places like downtown, where we're creating whole new residential neighborhoods that have never existed before. And we really don't have the plans in place to create safe pedestrian crossings for thousands and thousands of new people who are living downtown, for example. So I think I agree that we need to be more thoughtful in many ways in how we are, as policymakers, this is not to finance staff, as balancing those pieces of the puzzle.
This has been a great conversation. We've heard a lot of policy opinions that have gotten a little bit away from what the proposed budget is, but I think it was in the right places on the right things, the fiscal disparities piece, the TIF piece, some of these different changes being proposed. With the knowledge that it is already the end time of our scheduled time today, is there anything else that you really wish to highlight in your presentation?
So I do, Madam Chair, thank you. I would like to highlight quickly staff. Gina Powell on the budget team does a very good job of pulling together information very quickly as we get it from the county. So this is just showing our estimated impact across households of the 5.63% levy. So given what's happening in the marketplace, there's a thin red line between 5 and 6%, and so 50% of households would see a property tax increase greater than 5 to 6%. 50% would see a property tax increase of less than 5 to 6%. So this is information that we had provided last year on a ward-by-ward basis, and we'll be providing that for you again this year in the coming weeks as we have more time to dig into the numbers. The only, quickly I'll say on property taxes, it's important to remember and for you all to be talking with your constituents about the property tax refund program run by the state. So both property tax refund for homeowners and renters tax credit for renters. It is sort of income tested, but there is an opportunity for folks to apply and receive a rebate of some of the property taxes that they do pay. Finally, we are scheduled for a second budget overview on September 12th. In talking with Mr. Ruff and the chair about how best to use that time, we thought it would be good, anticipating that there may be questions, and I think we were proven right in that today, to really have that focus on questions that you still have lingering, would like answered. So certainly let us know what those are so that we can be prepared to come back and have additional good conversations like we've had today. I really appreciate the engagement and the intense policy discussion. I think that those who do live, work, and play in Minneapolis are really better for it. So I really appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you, Mr. Intramill. I do want to say, part of this is that you've explained this in a very compelling way. You've helped put this in terms of a story about our budget and what that means, and I think that's helped some of the more robust conversation today. You've explained some terms in detail that we haven't ever really dug into before in this type of budget presentation, such as the current service level and what that means. So there's far more detail of changes in this budget than there has been in the recent past in my time on City Council. So I hope that's helpful to our colleagues. We have made a couple of other improvements in the budget process, including an additional time to hear public comments throughout this process before we start digging in and making changes. Yeah, that's November 1st, as it shows on the slide right now. And I'd be happy to also speak with anybody individually about questions or really thoughts and ideas that they have to make this budget process go smoothly. So thank you for your time. Thank you, Mr. Ruff and the finance team. And thank you to my colleagues for the full amount of time today. With nothing else before, I should receive and file this presentation. So all those in approval, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? That carries. Our budget agenda is done for the day. Thank you. We're adjourned.